Welcome to this week's TZM Global Podcast. This is Ben McLeish speaking, and with me this week, once again, joining the fray is Matt Berkowitz of the Vancouver chapter. Please, Matt, register your existence by saying hello.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be back on another episode.
We are this week, at the behest of Matt, who came up with this idea, returning to the Q&A format. We have posted over the last week or so on our global Facebook page and on many other places, the request for questions from the audience, from the listenership, from the membership in general, about the general ideas put forth by the Zeitgeist Movement about what we refer to these days as a natural law, resource-based economy. I will describe that very briefly because I think the questions are themselves going to help with further characterizing what it is that we're even talking about. But if you are completely new and have for some reason decided that you have the excellent taste to tune in and listen to us babble on for a few hours, then a resource-based economy, a natural law resource-based economy, is that economy that you arrive at when you take into account the dynamic existence that you have on the planet as a singular system of energy income, of maximal employment of technology to serve the human family and service all of their needs in a dynamically updating way, in a way that pursues efficiency rather than what we call market efficiency, which is profit and essentially wealth accumulation, rather than actually the accumulation of a more successful, more updated, more stable, robust developmental system. This impinges in many different directions, partly in the realm of human health. That also, of course, talks about partly nutrition, or it can do. It talks about the various updates to agriculture that we could do, that can be absolutely foreseen by the current technology that we have, but that, we argue, is not put into play, is not actually pursued because it doesn't, quote, serve a profit. This also, of course, speaks to energy needs. Energy fuels everything, including agriculture and health, in the sense that it will have negative effects on the environment if you pollute too much, and of course will also see the shutdown of hospitals if there's not enough energy to service the civilization in a sustainable way. You can already see perhaps how these are interlocking. Hospital populations depend on health and nutrition, of course, as well, and on the stresses of being in a society. And of course, agriculture is informed by energy and hydrocarbons and oil-based products in all senses. This is probably where I'll stop because it goes in a number of other directions as well, but we broadly advocate the resolution of problems rather than the servicing of them for gains in capital and money. So, Matt, why don't we kick off, if it's okay with you, with the first one we have, which I'll read out for us. It is a very, very short one. It says, is TZM, the Zeitgeist Movement, a utilitarian concept? If so, in what ways? Now, Matt, I have a feeling that the utilitarianism discussed here is the Jeremy Bentham's characterization that may also have come from, I believe it was James Mill as well, that essentially posits that the correct focus of a society is to deliver the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and that's meant to increase over time. Would you consider that to be a correct reading of the question?
Yeah, I think so. It's basically a theory in normative ethics that talks about, arranging society or arranging a situation that has the maximizes the benefit for the most number of people and reduces suffering. So it can be misinterpreted in quite a few different ways. So I would just like to, I guess, warn against using any label to describe this, the principles that we talk about. If you call something utilitarian, a lot of people have the assumption that we're only analyzing in a very cold, analytical way the maximization of efficiency. That's what a lot of people get when they, what a lot of people misunderstand when trying to, understand the Zeitgeist Movement. They think that it's all about maximizing efficiency and sustainability, and it's sort of in some way devoid from the overall question, which is the reason for maximizing efficiency, which is the goal of maximizing human well-being. So that should be at the core. And if you can use the label utilitarian to describe it, so long as you keep in mind that refers to the goal of increasing well-being.
Yes, absolutely. The other undertones that utilitarianism, as per Bentham at least, sort of carry with them that I would warn against as well is that the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number automatically implies that there could be some subset that we can safely ignore as long as they constitute a minority.
Right.
That is, of course, a very, very good example of what we have now. In fact, actually now at the moment, I consider our system to be serving so few people that actually it's the majority that are ill-served by this system. But that is a point for debate, I suppose. But there is that undertone to it, like as long as things are fine or getting better for 75%, you can happily ignore 25%.
Right.
That's, of course, where the existence of classes end up coming from, or at least the disparate gap in welfare equals, a very unequal society. And we know from World Health Organization data that only leads to social ills in the long run. And the other one as well is that Jeremy Bentham, the kind of people who might say, is this utilitarian, tend to come from a point of view where they say, well, Jeremy Bentham also presided over prisons like the Panopticon, which actually luckily was never built the way he wanted it, although we can debate whether that's been done in the more abstract sense through surveillance. But people want to probably lock back utilitarianism to a sort of a weird centralized oversight system just because Bentham also did that. And so just be careful about that as well. I would say, yes, absolutely, we are trying to maximize and look after everybody on the planet. And those, of course, those needs are in different niches, aren't they? They have different levels of requirement.
And I'll add one more thing that I was reminded of when you're talking about how, the market system, it could be thought of to, increase its utilitarian output if you look at, ridiculous measures we use today, like GDP. So social progress often hides behind the banner that, okay, well, GDP is increasing, so the total benefit in the society must have increased. So therefore, we're increasing the total well-being. Well, I think one thing we need to be wary of is to get hung up on just one measure of well-being or one measure of health. We need to look at the totality here and understand that there are many aspects to human well-being and public health, and that some balance of all these major attributes is necessary to actually maximize well-being of as many people as possible.
I think that's well said. So we hope that we've answered that one. Number 2, do you want to read this one out? I think you're a fan of this question as well.
Yes. So number 2, do you have any tips on encouraging people to think more scientifically? Even in the movement, some people seem to love their new adopted paradigm so much that they are treating it like a belief. This becomes even more scary when they start going down the long, dark, twisting roads of conspiracy and spirituality. Also, are there any paradigms you have adopted yourselves since you joined the movement, which you have later questioned and debunked?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good.
Do you want to have a run at it?
Yeah, probably by the time this show is published on Blog Talk and on the YouTube channel, my upcoming talk will also be published. And that is called How to Know What's True, Assessing Scientific Research, which is something I've been wanting to address for a long time. But I guess we may as well touch upon some brief points in this episode. So, trying to think where to start here. Encouraging people to think more scientifically. That's what I tried to run down in my talk. I tried to go through a lot of the pitfalls that people make when assessing scientific research, such as taking the media seriously or looking at singular studies out of the bigger picture, or getting their information from blogs or even books, because that might not be a good representation of what actually is consisted of in the scientific literature. So I go through a lot of the pitfalls that people make when trying to review what may be true in a particular scientific field or about a particular claim. And then I spend the rest of the talk going through tools that people ought to use when trying to get to the bottom of many of these scientific issues, such as reviewing what the scientific consensus may be on a particular issue, looking at whether controversy that may exist in a particular field is manufactured by the political establishment, or whether there actually is controversy within the scientific community, stuff like this. So I'm not going to regurgitate a lot of the stuff I covered in that talk, but I'll just briefly point people to that talk that's probably out by now.
I've certainly found that there is a very dominating aspect of non-critical thinking that can be found anywhere, including in our movement. I would say that the scientific method has come to be prized by people who adopt the tenets of the Zeitgeist movement in a way that they probably had not considered it to be an important part of life before. That can be the case. It depends where you come from. If you come from a very political background, it may have never even crossed your mind that science and technology could be anything else but a product that can be used and bought and sold, and is almost ancillary to the way that the market system or that anything in society actually works. It could well be that you've changed that. But whether that means that you then exercise critical thought, eradicate fallacies from your mind and from your discourse, and express yourselves in ways that are clear and as free of bias as you can and as unemotional as you can, is a very different question. And I think a lot of people who are very disaffected have come to this movement as essentially, as a result of being underserved by the society, they can be angry from the get-go. And that, I think, can affect a lot of things. There's also a deep distrust, I think, of anything that is in the current state of affairs, as if absolutely everything were tainted by, I don't know, state funding, for example. We talked about this in our April 1 show, didn't we? The idea that essentially all of modern science can be thrown away, but then we have to apply the scientific method and basically rebuild everything up again. And perhaps there'll be free energy machines included in there. And perhaps there'll be something about the torus. And perhaps, it's all the nonsense that has existed before. So I would say that, a lot of people are trying. Of course, we're all learning out loud. We're all in a developmental state, and we're certainly not perfect. And that's sort of the second part of the question, too. Are there any paradigms that you have yourself adopted that you have later questioned and debunked? That's absolutely true of me. I will admit now that I had a deep distrust of vaccines. Although I'd known for a while that Andrew Wakefield's study, for example, was garbage science that had been bought and paid for by lawyers, and had read the retraction notice once it came out, which is actually quite recently compared to when the story started. But nevertheless, I had a feeling that the general existence of mercury in compounds could have an effect on something like autism. Of course, once you spend some time actually looking at the people who are involved and looking at the actual data, you realize that is something that at the moment is not only unproven, but in fact disproven, that there aren't those kinds of correlatives there. Now, it's not necessarily to do with the TZM worldview, but it's something that I did have as a belief that I then moved away from. I did, of course, before I was in the movement, also subscribe to some sort of political effect. I did believe for a while that we were just voting in the wrong people, and that you could essentially vote, let's say, vote in, for example, the Greens, and you would get somewhere else. I have since then spoken with people who actually run as Green candidates. In fact, just yesterday I was speaking to Ian from the Baltimore chapter, who also runs, as a sideline, runs in the Green campaign. And he was telling me that people happily have called him up right before a debate happens and tell him not to talk about certain things. And it's all to do with currying favor with whoever has the largest amount of power. It's an absolute demonstrable fact now that the system, the way it's set up, you cannot vote your way into a rational system. So I certainly moved away from that.
Yeah, and I've had a few things that I've just accepted as true that we've talked about in the past. I may get in trouble for talking about this on the air in much detail, but I basically had to recently go back and question some of the assumptions and beliefs I had about the supposed inside job nature of 9/11. And yeah, I know some listeners are going to get angry at that, but I've changed my mind on that issue. I've relooked at certain issues regarding alternative medicine, and now much more side with what I guess you could call mainstream science in the fields of pharmacology and whatnot. Although there are obviously still problems there, and I go into a lot of them in the talk I just did. But yeah, I mean, I would say that nowadays, compared to say 5 years ago when I first stumbled across the Zeitgeist movement, I'm much more skeptical and just don't buy into a lot of this alternate science stuff that was being asked about in the question, really, about spirituality and new age stuff. And so yeah, I think we've laid that one to rest. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I'm certainly looking forward to updating my views on something. I don't know yet what it'll be, but I know it'll happen again at some point, and it's going to be enjoyable to be, as Matt Dillahunty says, and as you quote him in your speech, that you want to be as right about as many things as possible and as wrong about as few things as possible. I look forward to being less wrong as soon as I possibly can.
Right.
Number 3, good one, this one. Do we want the singularity? And if we don't, can we prevent it? And if so, how? I must admit I'm a little bit confused by this question, because it appears to suggest that we can either want or absolutely not want something. I suppose the question is good in the sense that it doesn't apparently make clear whether the singularity is a good or a bad thing. For anybody who doesn't know what the singularity is, if we're going to assume that it means the technological singularity that the humanity plus people and the futurists and the transhumanists speak about, it's that moment in technological progress, sometime they guess around 2029, 2030, 2035, something like that, where technological progress, having doubled every year as it appears to do in speed, in size, in scope, inching ever closer to what they call hard AI, strong AI, sorry, it gets to the point where it's no longer possible to follow it without being updated yourself. Essentially that things are changing at such a rapid pace that it's almost like a very sped up version of what we hear grandparents saying these days. They say, well, in my day, things didn't move as fast as they did, you know, and look at it now, 30 years later, it's amazing. This would be a conversation you could have every minute in the singularity and say, I can't believe from a minute ago to now, things are just so different. And it gets to a point where the human hardware, the wetware, as they say, can essentially no longer keep up with the sheer size and knowledge and speed of everything that essentially comes along with incredibly fast and evolving technology that can essentially evolve itself as well. Whether I want this or not is a really good question, I suppose, because it asks very large questions about how you feel about essentially becoming mostly or partly machine and being updated in a way that we just can't marry up with the idea of humanity just yet. However, we are quite happy to have electronic ears and electronic eyes, like that gentleman who jumped on a grenade and has now received the Purple Heart. And I think only the first person who was living to get a Purple Heart. Is this not in some way a bionic human these days? Well, not really, because he's still got his... We probably defer to the fact that he has his brain still. But Ray Kurzweil, who popularized the word singularity, although it comes from Vernon Vinge, he is now working at Google as the head of the technological development. I can't remember his exact job title. And part of his scope, part of his remit, and what his most recent book is about, is how to outsource parts of your brain to an external structure. So something like the internet. They think they call it an exobrain. And essentially, as we use the internet, we are, in a sense, really deferring our brains to an outside knowledge source that we can command at any moment, very much like our memory, except that we hope it's more stable, more efficient, can be more accurate, can not be subject to so many astonishing confusions as we seem to have. And so maybe we are already on the way there. I would probably be a bit of a... It might be a bit neo-Luddite to say... that we could prevent such a thing. And I would not know how, other than the attempts by... I mean, the people who've tried to attempt to smash technology and hold back technology have always been of questionable ethical standpoints, like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who was very much a primitivist of sorts. And other people like, well, I mean, I don't know if Ned Ludd, from whom the Luddites get their name, was even a real person, but it's always been this bizarre idea that one can somehow smash and go back to something basic. So I don't know where I quite fall on that. How about you, Matt?
So it seems to me that the question we really need to ask is, what sort of socioeconomic system is most compatible with the coming, or the proposed coming singularity? Meaning, what sort of system will best allow or adapt to the changes of technological expansion and the acceleration of technological development, which I don't think is stoppable unless you just divert all our resources that go into R&D for that type of thing. I mean, why would we want to prevent that? Isn't it better to look at updating our socioeconomic system to accommodate these changes rather than trying to prevent technology for the sake of our outdated economic system. So that seems to be the real issue for me. And I think it's really that simple. I mean, it's easy to envision dystopian scenarios for how technology could be misused and abused under the current socioeconomic system. But if you live in a if you're in a resource-based economy, natural law resource-based economy, what really is the structural basis for a lot of the abuse of technology that exists today? I mean, it really wouldn't exist. So to me, the question really is an economic system question rather than whether we want to embrace technological expansion or not.
I agree. I did speak to some futurists about this, and one of the questions they kept asking me was, and this plays into your idea about the economic assumptions of a society. They said, if people have worked on allowing people to live forever, let's say, which is it's going to be an aspect of the singularity, I think, if it happens, it would be a sort of an ability to beat death. It's one of the great final frontiers, I suppose, in their eyes. If that were the case, should the people who've invented the technology get more of the resources than the rest? Was the question that was asked to me. And in that lies the dangerous thing that I think people are really afraid of. There's a certain type of libertarianism that goes along with the singularitarians. And if you listen to some of their most savvy businessmen and businesswomen, they're very obvious when you look into this. They tend to be essentially selling already very, very large, incredible either conversions for cryostasis, and so waiting for the technology to catch up. So in other words, a lot of money. So if you allow that, you essentially have a very two-tiered system. A two-tiered system that is so extreme that essentially you get to the very scary point where certain people can live forever because they have the money, and therefore have almost infinitely more needs and wants than anybody who can't afford to. And I think that's the thing that most people seem to be afraid of, is that we're heading for, if we were to have this market system
right.
and that kind of technological capability, you would end up with an extremely terrifying scenario
right.
of the most extreme entitlement of all time.
Yeah, and on that sense, it's definitely a legitimate fear to have about coming technological developments. Okay, let's move on to question 4.
Indeed.
What do you propose we do with people who see the merit of our train of thought but have economic problems and cannot contribute actively until they have some kind of economic relief? There are people who have told us, the Greek chapter, we are an impractical and or elitist movement because not everyone can contribute, since you need to have some kind of economic security, even if rather small.
That's a great question, isn't it? The Greek chapter, of course, I mean, there'll be almost nobody who doesn't know this, but Greece is undergoing, and has been undergoing since late 2008, an extreme economic catastrophe, where public servants now no longer have milk or toilet paper or anything at work and have to bring it in themselves. They've had pay freezes, pay cuts, library budgets have been cut. Essentially all the depredation and deselection that one expects from late-stage capitalism. David J. Blacker, who wrote a book called The Falling Rate of Learning and the Neoliberal Endgame, it's a fantastic title of a book, he calls it despoilation capitalism or something. It's another description of it. It can seem extremely distant in the midst of real-life catastrophe and very, very difficult social situations where, as to be expected, right-wing parties like the Golden Dawn are being voted in, just as they are now in the UK and in Denmark and in France, all at once, not accidentally a byproduct of severe economic hardships that cause fear and allow demagogues to play on those fears. It can seem very distant to come to that and say, hey, you know what we really need is like integrated city systems and maglev trains, because all people are seeing is absolutely no money to even service their basic needs, let alone the, quote, utopian fantasy of something so distant and so futuristic and so far removed from anything that they've ever seen. So I do understand that. However, dear members of the Greek chapter, I would say that one cannot affect the right kind of change without always keeping the goal in mind. And that's how I would answer that question. Oh, you're impractical and or elitist. You are never going to be able to affect the most correct change and act in a way that is in line with the ultimate goal without always explaining what the ultimate goal is. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where you say, hey, food banks and time banks are a good solution short term for the economic crisis. And then that's where the thought ends, and people don't realize why food and time banks are needed, and why where that failure has come from in the market system in which we find ourselves. So you can perhaps temper the way you speak and say, yes, I understand, things are extremely bad, and amidst all the scandal and corruption, we are being aggressed against by a very, very failed state and an international banking system that's not making it any easier. However, the root core of the problem doesn't lie with any of those things. Those are all an outgrowth of illegitimate principles of preference. Probably not a good way of describing it, actually, because that would sound rather elitist. The priorities have failed, and the priorities are what have to be changed, and the ultimate referent needs to be the Earth system and the needs of people. But that doesn't stop you from saying, in the short term, yes, we need to get free meals to people, and we somehow need to allow tips for gardening in your own home, or anything to alleviate the failures of supply chain economics.
Right. I think one more thing I'll address is that you don't have to make your activism a 40-hour-a-week job. It can just be something that you do 1 hour every few weeks. I mean, this is one of the reasons we created the whole One Planet project a couple of years ago, where it doesn't really cost anything to go out and speak in the city center of your city. You ask a few questions to people, and you inform them about the Zeitgeist Movement. Maybe you have a table, some DVDs, and some pamphlets. I mean, it's really not that expensive, and while people are in pain and impoverished, they might not be so willing to spend their time doing this type of activism. But as long as you have a core chapter in your in your local city, you have a dedicated group of people that are able to hold something like this together, and you just keep planting seeds with your acting as a community presence in your local city. We always talk about biopsychosocial pressures, or biosocial pressures that influence people in rough economic times, such that they're more receptive to alternate systems. So maybe you can use that to your advantage in Greece or wherever you might be, because there are problems everywhere and people are hurting everywhere. So they're looking for something that's new. On the flip side of that, there's also something to be said that people who have a degree of economic security will be the ones who are more likely to be able to think about these ideas, to actually have the time to consider ideas that go beyond just meeting their basic human needs, and those people will also might be more receptive. So I think it works both ways, and like you say, Ben, just really have to focus on the bigger picture here and not get caught up in. I mean, while we need to focus on these short-term solutions to ease pain, we can't let that be the entirety of our focus.
Absolutely. Number 5. This is a question which names its author. This is from Mario Kos, who was recently on the show with you to discuss scientific literacy, which is very relevant. This is a good one. I need to read this out so I can pass it one more time. I have a sense there's a lot in here. So there's a principle in evolution, and I'm not sure that it has a specific name, although it probably does, wherein when a more complex organism or feature of an organism is looked at and its lineage is traced back across time, at every instance along the way of the process of evolution, that specific organism or feature of that organism conferred a benefit and increased advantage. For instance, to get from a once light-sensitive patch of skin to the eye of a modern eagle with its precision and high level of detail perception, all the various phases in between those two features, increased the survival of the organism. In relation to a more sane society, should we be thinking about ways in which we can arrive at such a society by means of making it such that the people alive at any given point along that process are actually acting in ways that are advantageous to them throughout the process? Is that feasible, or do we think more along the lines of creating change that is more abrupt and dramatic? Not sure that this question makes sense or is clear. It sort of makes sense in my head. Hopefully I communicated it correctly. Oh, I think you communicated that very well.
Yeah.
There's a danger in comparing biological evolution to social evolution. I was thinking about this today. It's not necessarily identical. We love to talk about social evolution. Federico did it last year in Z-Day 2013, but it's a very different process. On top of that, and it is in your question, there are, of course, different ways that evolution behaves on a biological level. There can be times when a particular change, a particular, what's the word, mutation has stuck around for more than a few generations without actually being useful, and it becomes useful later on. Similarly, those kinds of mutations can ultimately lead to vestigial organs, which actually don't have all that much use. Although I have heard the claim recently that at least the appendix appears to have some kind of vestigial actually use rather than just being vestigial. But no doubt it came from eating grass, and we no longer do that. Anyway, that's a more general point. Is it doesn't have to be that things are selected against on a biological level purely because they didn't serve a function at that time. If it were that way, we'd have a very, very clean evolution indeed, which we really know that we don't from all the various fallen species that we have, let alone all of the billions of species that never made it because they simply couldn't survive even one generation. But having said that, the question itself is rather an interesting one. So is there some way in which there's a gradualistic way of developing our social organism? Or do we try and be a little bit more disruptive? And do we try and make a more dramatic change? So is there some kind of almost revolutionary idea? Or do we pursue a more gradualistic approach? I think there's probably an argument that says that a little bit of both can be done.
Yeah.
A lot of people, for example, have not quite yet realized the impact of 3D printing. I'll give you an example in how it is incredibly powerful towards alleviating the environmental damage that we're causing through CO2. If we, let's say, have the point where we can get half of our products by manufacturing them extremely locally, either in your house or in your locale. Let's say you need a much more serious industrial 3D printer that you can't practically have in your house. If you're not ordering that stuff from China and you're dropping the demand of international shipping, one of those mega tankers uses in 1 year the same amount of fuel, produces the same cancer-causing elements as 50 million cars.
Right.
Now, there were 9,500 in those in 2010, which if you multiply, and I'll let you do this at home, multiply 50 million by almost 10,000 and see what number you get. It is in the billions. In other words, we're talking about a level of pollution that is beyond any number of cars we have on this planet. And if we could even approach half of that with 3D printing, we suddenly not only see people's needs getting met in very specific ways with shared designs online that really allow for a lot of individualistic servicing. It's like you have your own production center for each human now, but you're actually using a dramatically lower amount of resources. Resources are very energy intensive to make and are very, very filthy and are not regulated at all. And at the same time, you're dropping the environmental impact of those things. It's sort of a huge side effect. And I think that's a very cartoonish example. It's very basic. I think there are going to be all kinds of social evolutionary pressures that will have positive unintended consequences.
Yeah. I want to reiterate your point about the danger in comparing biological evolution to social evolution. That's, of course, how we got the famous perversion of Darwin's natural selection to survival of the fittest, coined by Herbert Spencer, who basically corrupted Darwin's thinking and for his own political right-wing ideology. And you could say that that's at the heart of the capitalist system. So there's a very big danger there in comparing the two, or in modeling society after naturalistic processes. In the Zeitgeist Movement, when we talk about using natural law as a referent, that's all we mean, using it as a referent, not mimicking it exactly, because there are many things that happen in nature that we certainly do not want to experience in our society. So that's one point. Number two is, I think the answer to this question depends on how we transition to another economic system. Whether that transition is more painful, or whether it's more gradual, or whether it's more smooth and without too much pain, it depends on or reflects the answer to this question. So let's say that we have a huge energy crisis where we realize too late that a shift outside of the hydrocarbon economy to something more renewable. If we realize this too late, such that we don't have enough oil or natural gas to make this infrastructure switch, well, that's going to be a very painful transition. And to even speak about operating in a way that confers benefits to the transition. I mean, I have a hard time even wrapping my head around how that would be done. There's an illimitable number of transition scenarios we could come up with, and I think we just sort of have to take it as it comes, as the variables present themselves to us, rather than thinking about. I mean, obviously, we want to ease the pain as much as we can, and one way to do this would be to, if we realize this change that is necessary sooner than later, we can start building systems of energy and food production and transportation to gradually wean off the market system that would ease the pain that it creates. So I know that's kind of all over the place, but I just wanted to make it clear that this is kind of a weird question in the sense of modeling social evolution or society after natural processes.
Yes, it's a real shame. It's one of those historical ironies that Darwin actually did end up inserting survival of the fittest into, what, the 6th edition, was it, of Origin of Species? If he had not done that, people wouldn't be able to quote him directly saying that phrase. But yes, you're absolutely right, of course. And I think that's, it's a good one. That question, I think, will give me a lot of thought, actually, as we carry on. But I certainly see both. I see the interventionist and the more slowly developmental stuff. Well, a very good example that springs to mind is solar roadways, which has raised 1.6 million so far, not from the government, not from private corporations, from individuals around the world. And it was just created by individuals too. That's quite an individualistic thing, has libertarian overtones, but who cares? Because the ultimate goal is actually the opposite of the libertarian model. It's the creation of plenty within the structure of the society itself as a systemic byproduct. And I think it's wonderful, and I think bizarrely, even though we of course advocate and move away from money ultimately, or we foresee it with the if you follow the actual train of thought of where jobs, where economy, where efficiency goes, and what happens to money when you do that. Funnily enough, it seems to be in the short term, at least now, even while we're very, very far outside a transition scenario, that we still see stuff being built now that's absolutely in line with what we talk about. Right, number 6.
Move on. Yeah.
Open bins is one method TZM proposes for food distribution. But as people today still live in scarcity/fear, this could lead to abuse and hoarding. Do you think in transition, users will have to register to these open bin systems and have their amounts kept tracked via simple swipe cards or something similar, and ultimately be limited to certain amounts? Matt, what do you think?
Let's look at certain resources that are available today within the monetary system in abundance, that people don't hoard. If there are apple trees all over the city, if there are berry trees all over the city, do you need to track people's, consumption of these resources? Obviously not. And this is within the mentality and the value system of the market system. So my initial response would be no, but with a caveat. When making this transition, there's going to be a lot of obsolete value systems that still need to be overcome, and we need to have a way of highlighting or discovering misuse or abuse of the system by certain inhabitants. And I guess this is related to any field of public health. Like, what do you do with people who commit aberrant behavior? I think that's where really this question is rooted. So I mean, this is a complex question to consider. We won't have policemen as they exist today monitoring everyone and acting like parasites to try to give people parking tickets or speeding tickets just to feed the system and meet ticket quotas and everything. The public health officials that will exist, or likely will exist in a resource-based economy, will be people who are trained in whatever respective field that they're in, sociology, psychology, or some degree of both, or of many disciplines. And we'll have systems in place that can identify, okay, these people in this area, they were, for some reason, consuming 10 times the amount of food, or taking 10 times the amount of food than is really necessary to meet their calorie needs per day. So that would send up a flag on the system somewhere, and we could deal with the situation accordingly, whether that means removing the person and counseling them because they're just trying to mess things up, or whether they actually have a need for it for some actual scientific reason to consume more resources. So I guess that's where I'll leave it for now. I'll see what your thoughts are on the issue, and then maybe I'll add something more.
For anybody who doesn't know what the questioner might mean by food bins, we essentially mean, or have at least expressed it this way, and that is that we would essentially have large storehouses, almost, I suppose, a little bit like supermarkets, but they would look a lot different because supermarkets are laid out to maximize their marketing, actually get you to consume more, ironically. So it probably wouldn't be that laid out. But they would essentially be open, large places where you can go in and grab your food or whatever else it is for free. Of course, we also foresee production on a very localized scale where you could essentially have, I say that word too much. My family pointed this out to me recently. You could have your own agriculture very, very close in your neighborhood. The real redundancy, the real greatness of this kind of approach is that you would probably have many more places to get your food from than you currently do. You would have more than just the supermarket down the road and the convenience store next to you. You would have maybe 10 or 15 places where you could, in a very open way, get fresh produce and specialized items. Now, imagine how difficult it is to abuse that, as long as you are not, of course, also simply producing as much food as possible without actually making sure that you can carry on with it. But we could produce a lot more than we do now, waste a lot less, and it's actually quite hard to waste on an individual level when you are really pursuing it on a level like that. Having said that, I know what the questioner means, because I have been to all-you-can-eat Chinese and Indian restaurants before, where what is the first thing that people do? They have 2 hours to eat, which is plenty, and they have paid their money, and it's an unlimited plate. What's the first thing they do? They pile as much as they can onto the first plate, as if it's going out of fashion, even though the very way that you have bought this means that you actually don't have to do that. But people can't handle it, can they? They can't handle the idea of abundance, and yes, you can go back and have another portion, or you can have something else. It's remarkable how it happens. I found myself doing it too at times. I completely understand that in a place that we are psychosocially, so to speak, shoving as much on your plate and defeating your neighbor at who can put the most curry in their mouth at the same time is utterly understandable. So in some senses, I think the reason our movement exists, and the reason that the growing anti-consumerism movements out there and sustainability movements are in fact a form of social therapy for those impulses at themselves. That's the real skill, is to get the population ready to act in responsible ways so that they don't have to be limited by coercion. It's the kind of coercion that produces people wanting to fuck the system over and wanting to take as much as possible because the damn John Law is keeping me down and that kind of stuff, So it's a mixture of all of those things. On one side, real brilliant efficiency would mean that it would actually be really hard to screw it up, but on the other side, understanding how that efficiency is achieved and the social aspect behind it would change the way that you consume the way you do now.
That brings to mind one more real-world example. So people who work at Starbucks, who have worked at Starbucks in the past, every week they get a pound of coffee that they're allowed to take home, or I can't remember what it is. Once a week, they get to take it home for free. Most of the employees, most people can't drink that much coffee per week. So what ends up happening? They just don't use their allotment, or they give their allotment to someone else. So that's in the market system, having basically unlimited access to a particular good or resource, and they're not hoarding it, or and oftentimes they're not even taking their full allotment. So I think there's a lot to be said about just the fact that when things are in abundance without a price tag, with no monetary resale value, with no fear of scarcity, like would have existed maybe in the buffet example that you used, because there's still a finite amount of food that the restaurant makes. If that doesn't exist, then I think the tendency to want to hoard would be pretty much eliminated, and the only tendencies that would exist would be sort of residual fears and cultural baggage from the market system.
Yes. I think ultimately we would see that hoarding would be as rare as extreme hoarding is now. Yeah, so now the guy who fills up his house with newspapers and old umbrellas is weird to most people in the hoarding mentality system that we have. And if you pursue that most logically outwards in the future, it would be most people who consider that the way we live now to be astonishingly hoarding. What? You have a house full of things? That's weird. Why don't you live anywhere in the world and have, you know, any number of wonderful things, but things that are delivered in service rather than as a good? So yeah, that's a great example about Starbucks. I'll admit now, I used to work at Starbucks myself, but I was never given a pound of coffee a week. That would have been good. But yes, what happens? People don't use it. It doesn't. It's not like they take it home and then throw it in the bin. People don't need to be trained away from that. Because if anything, it's boring to keep doing that every week. You just not do it. So there are certain things about this that just make absolute common sense, where the reinforcer is actually common sense and not, and actually what's easy, what's convenient for you. It's actually quite inconvenient to be wasteful when you have that kind of abundance. That's a good example. I'm going to steal that. Would you like to read the next one, sir?
Sure. So this is number 7. In what ways can individuals and self-help groups and other organizations, whether it be governmental, NGOs, NPOs, etc., help in order to make a natural law resource-based economy a reality? So, in what ways can individuals and self-help groups help? So, I mean, individuals, that's what the Zeitgeist Movement is for. So I'll just go to the self-help group part of that question. Now, I guess it depends on what is referred to as a self-help group. But I suppose one aspect of the transition will be in certain people who have been socialized so despotically by the system, they may need some sort of counseling or community support groups in order to get through a lot of the baggage that they've been stuck with the system. So I think a lot of these community support help groups could be instrumental in helping people make this transition from a robustly competitive cutthroat society to a cooperative system where people actually help each other. That's just what springs out to me immediately, but I guess this could go off in many different tangents. What do you think, Ben?
Yes, I mean, there are many different ways that we're suffering in our system right now. I mean, one of the things that I think is a byproduct is definitely the alcoholism that we have. And of course, self-help groups in that sense, where people are relying on each other to beat a certain addiction is of course going to be useful, because we ultimately want a society that's as free as possible from addictive substances, I suppose, and addiction predispositions. Yeah, tendencies, that's the one I mean, yeah. Self-medication, those kinds of things. I think all of that is really useful. I think that I cannot see these as enemy organizations. I can't see them as things that impede things. They're, of course, not any kind of solution by themselves, but the pursuit of people to give their free time and their support, whether emotional or whatever, to the emotional, robust strengthening of others is a value that is already in line with what we're talking about and will be needed in many different ways. It's interesting because I know of people in the past who've approached the Zeitgeist Movement as if it were a group therapy organization, because people who are disaffected will come to movements like this and will seek essentially a free emotional help from a movement that admits itself of being not capable of offering that on a medical and official level.
Right.
There's simply no qualification for it. It's not what it's for. But so in that sense, other organizations that really do offer those are phenomenal help, because that's where people should go, it would sort of be a thing that's in tandem. Now, with things like NGOs or governmental things, I have a little bit more of a problem, because ultimately it gets to the point, I suppose, if it's a governmental, it's tricky. I mean, there are some examples I can give where essentially government programs to promote smoking cessation often simply peddle in further nicotine replacement therapy, which is more products, doesn't solve the problem. But if it's something much greater, whether it's to do with mental health or whether it's to do with even things like research institutes, European research institutes or whatever, that are pursuing certain types of sciences, of course that helps as well. So it gets very tricky after a while. Certainly, I think I would put it this way. the road to a robust, sustainable society that runs along the natural law, resource-based economy tangent is going to be harder to achieve if we had none of these organizations. I'd put it like that. I think it becomes much clearer to people if I put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's, we'll leave that one there.
Sure. Yeah, because the next one is way more complicated.
Oh, yeah.
Shall I? Here we go. Ready? Can you go into details how love, quote, love, and relationships will work in a resource-based economy? How will we avoid the frustration from being rejected in creating an unhappy society? And how will equality of the sexes be reconciled with our biological evolutionary urges to select our mates? Will the undesirable mates be simply left out? Not even Fresco went into detail on this. That's Jacques Fresco, for anybody who's wondering. And his quote, brackets, parenthetically written, partial explanation left me very unsatisfied. Hope to hear what you guys have to say. This question rears itself every time, or versions of it do every time, as if there is some kind of exact spectrum of permissible sexual or emotional behavior that could exist. I will say the following. The promotion of heterosexual, mostly marriage-based, and mostly male-dominant tendencies are not scientific. I'll put it that way. Obviously, sexual reproduction as it works normally is, of course, a scientific process, a biological process. But we're now getting to the point where two people of the same sex can essentially have a child that is their own, biologically, genetically, through various amounts of implanting and all the rest of it. There are, of course, also people who adopt children. I don't know why there are people who don't adopt, as Doug Stanhope says, adopt an old man who's already here and very lonely. So there's all kinds of elements here that don't necessarily need to be defined or don't need to be endorsed in order to have a stable society. However, some of the caveats in this question are very good. So, for example, the equality of the sexes. There is no reason, really, in the present system why women get paid less than men in almost all walks of life, from the CEO level down to standard worker levels, down to even being a tennis player and being given less prize money. I've yet to hear a convincing argument why this is the case, other than it's the age-old institutional bullshit that we've got from the times of old, that was instituted simply because it could be. Same goes for, of course, we realize how undesirable it is when we consider that exactly this kind of differential can be found within what we call races as well, ethnic class groups that are treated differently. Ultimately, if we're to get to a society that treats human beings with the kind of respect that human beings deserve as individuals, the whole definition of sex as being treated differently goes away, because it's just as arbitrary and absurd as ethnic developments as well. What do you think of that, Matt, before I move on?
Those are all good points. I'm trying to think of where I should start or what I should address here. If you think about the monetary society we live in today, just think of how many relationships exist today only because of money. I mean, how many people get married just for some sort of, legal bullshit reason, or immigration, or people marrying for money, or think of all this stuff. There'd be a much more profound basis for relationships to flourish and thrive in a system where we weren't coerced into figuring out a way to make money. So on that level, relationships would be much more likely to be legitimate and not forced due to external pressures. Trying to think where else I should go with this.
Can I add an extra point to that, actually? Because there's the other flip side as well. I have seen up close relationships that only exist because people can't actually afford to get divorced. Right. There's the other side of things. They're forced into staying in a loveless, horrendous, and very codependent, in the negative sense, I mean, codependency, state, because they simply couldn't afford to get divorced. And then have two houses? It doubles your costs. It's unbelievable. And so, I mean, just think of the negative effects that would be alleviated simply through serving people so well and allowing for such a level of a baseline that you could actually quite easily leave somebody and live a life that's not deprived and that doesn't have all those stress effects. So that just came to my mind.
Yeah, so let me try to tackle this part of the question. Will the undesirable mates be simply left out? So that's quite an elusive question. So now remember, the market system, there's almost no such thing as a functional family. Almost every family is dysfunctional in some way due to monetary pressures, due to stress, and there's all kinds of neglect, even in the healthiest households. So, I mean, where do these undesirable people come from? They're obviously a product of the system that, you know, doesn't give a shit about them, that doesn't give them the tools they need, or the biological and psychological needs that all of us need in order to grow up to be a fully functioning human being. So, there'd be a lot less of a tendency, or a lot less reinforcement for people to grow up and not have the social skills or the tools to interact with other people and develop relationships. That's one thing I'd say. And number two, we have to get out of we need to stop thinking in absolutes. Okay, this isn't a utopia that we're advocating. There's no such thing as a perfect society where everyone has a perfect relationship and there are no problems. All we can do is build the socioeconomic foundations that will be most likely to lead to people being able to develop truly love-filled relationships. So let's stop thinking in terms of we're not going to have any problems. We will, but we can reduce them significantly based on the negatives that cause all these relationship problems in our society today.
I'm reminded of the crazed ramblings of a gentleman called Elliot Rodger, who is the man behind the recent shootings in America, who claimed that at 22 he was a virgin and had been ignored by the female sex in some sort of presumably group acting way. I mean, that's what he seemed to say, was females in general had spurned him. Now, is it a complete accident? And I will leave this as a question rather than answer it myself. Is it a complete accident that Elliot Rodger was deeply, deeply materialistic and loved fast cars and posing on Facebook and producing endless selfies and obsessed with societal position and wealth and stature and status? I'll leave that for you to ponder, because it seems a rather interesting thing to suggest that there might be a correlative between all the worst parts and all the most egregious behaviors of our society and sexual dysfunction.
Okay, question 9. It's a continuation from question 8. Also, what do you think of NASA and Guy McPherson's predictions that the world will be totally devastated by global warming that has now just passed the point of no return and will simply advance due to feedback loops already existing in the system? Do the TZM and TVP movements even mean anything when we know the world will turn into a hellhole beyond our wildest horror nightmares in the next 20 to 30 years? How to reconcile the positive attitude that promotes an RBE, inspires with the bitter reality of things to come? Okay, so yeah, how do we reconcile the possible doom and gloom with the positive attitudes that we promote in the movement?
Yep.
Okay, well, climate change is a very real thing. There's an overwhelming scientific consensus that human activity is contributing to climate change, and this new report basically highlighted the very serious repercussions that could materialize if we don't, drastically change our activities on this planet. So, I mean, what do we think by it? All we can do is really, interpret the science and report the science that's conducted by the scientific community. And this is nothing really new to us. We know we're destroying the environment, even if anthropogenic climate change is overemphasized in the scientific community. I don't think there's any reason to think it is, but even if it is, we're still destroying the environment at an almost immeasurable rate. So yeah, we embrace the obvious fact that we need to drastically change our socioeconomic activity, and the only way we're going to do that is if we drastically shift the economic system. And then how do we reconcile this with with the positive message for social change? Well, I mean, what we've always done in the Zeitgeist Movement is point out the root causes of our broadest social and economic problems, and warning people that this is what's going to happen if we continue to act the way we do, while at the same time offering a positive message of not only hope but practical, realistic solutions in the way of scientific and technological solutions. So I think you can be cognizant of both. Be aware of the immense amount of damage that can be done by us if we continue to do what we're doing, and also try to focus more on the solutions, the positive capabilities that we have at our disposal. If we focus on that and try to reach critical mass of what is possible, rather than get hung up on doom and gloom like many forms of social activism tend to do, I think that will be more conducive to actually realizing these solutions.
Yes, I'll add a few things because I'm somewhat familiar with, I would say, the tactics rather than the work of Guy McPherson, and the way that environmental catastrophes are overstated. I don't say that that they are being unnecessarily overstated, but I'll give you an example from The Guardian from last week, which on the whole was actually a very good article by George Monbiot. It was called, and I will get it up, it's right in front of me actually, it's called "It's Simple. If we can't change our economic system, our numbers up," which is a nice way of putting it. George Monbiot, fan of nuclear power that he is right about that. And the first thought experiment is very telling, because I just want people to understand how careful they have to be when we are talking in characteristic terms about the planet, which is what Guy McPherson does. So the quote from the article begins like this: "Let us imagine that in 3030 BC, the total possessions of the people of Egypt filled 1 cubic meter. It's unclear whether he means 1 cubic meter per person or in total, but it doesn't matter. Let us propose that these possessions grew by 4.5% a year. How big would that stash have been by the Battle of Actium in 30 BC? This is the calculation performed by the investment banker Jeremy Grantham. Go on, take a guess. 10 times the size of the pyramids? All the sand in the Sahara? The Atlantic Ocean? The volume of the planet? A little more? It's 2.5 billion solar systems. It does not take you long pondering this outcome to reach the paradoxical position that salvation lies in collapse. Or collapse indeed lies in salvation. Now, of course, who ever said that the possessions of the human population are growing by 4.5% a year? Obviously, that is it's deliberately overstating the situation. However, the underlying point is correct, and that is that if we just look at the numbers and say we need to get X percent per year growth, and the longer that's sustained, the better, of course we're heading for a phenomenal collapse. On the point of Guy McPherson, he is a man who is known to take his quotes out of context to the point at which he will misquote other activists and attack their positions quite unnecessarily. He gave up his position at the University of Arizona to live on a doomstead, as they call it, with someone else. And according to at least one podcaster who has had him on before, it has gone so awry and it is so uncomfortable now that he admits privately that the resolution to the doomstead problem that they have now would be homicide, that it's that serious. This colors the way he speaks, and he relies on data from Malcolm Light, Light, which is not recognized by the scientific community as a valid data source. The data source lies in the claim that the gas is being released from, I believe it's the Antarctic. You can fact check me on this. It's totally Googleable. Are going to cause huge problems, and there is a profitable techno fix that Malcolm Light endorses that he owns that would help solve this. Again, we see the encroachment of the market system on the problems of the planet. Now, not quite the same may be said of NASA, whose report I must admit I have not yet read, but it's extremely dire. We do live in some extremely deadly times, and it should not be taken lightly. It's a pun on Malcolm's name. But it also, if expressed incorrectly, can lead to you sounding shrill, or for people to find themselves very pessimistic, depressive, and finding themselves just simply living for today and screw all the rest of it. It's a dangerous fork in the road in our activism, because one has to really wake people up with this stuff. But you have to make sure that you are not coming off as someone who should not be believed, because it is the Chicken Little skies falling scenario once again, as true as it may be. So you have to be quite eloquent at this. It's quite tricky as well, because climate science is not easy. People like Nicole Foss, who are very tenured climate scientists, completely admit that it's very, very hard to predict how the future will happen. If you take one side of the equation, people like Malcolm Light and people like Guy McPherson say it's going to be a sudden crash. Michael Rupert fits in there as well. It's a cliff that we're heading towards. It's all over in 30 years, and it'll be the big, what they call the die-off in peak oil circles. And then you have other people who see a more slow grind. People like James Howard Kunstler, who talks about the long emergency, wrote a book of the same name. And there was another gentleman as well, John Michael Greer, who says that actually the collapse that we're looking at may take 200 years, and it may get much, much worse and worse and worse, but it'll seem normal to each generation that's born into it. Very much like a reverse of where history has led us till now. There were people in Victorian England who couldn't afford a bath a week, let alone a bath a month. And if you wanted it to be heated, it would be 1 penny, which is like £50 now. And who lived with several children who were already dead in their own places. They lived without sewer systems. They lived with cholera and the expectation to die at the age of 48. This was ordinary to them. That was a successful life. And people like John Michael Greer claim that that's the kind of crash that we're looking at. Whether or not I fall on that side or on the more terrifying side is up for debate, I suppose. But I would be careful to take only NASA and only Guy McPherson and only Rupert, who in his later years was directly in contact with and basically took his entire worldview from Guy McPherson and claimed that it was peer-reviewed and agreed. And it's not, in fact, agreed what Guy McPherson talks about uniformly, at least. Not that that delivers you of anything, but one must not just temper everything so that we feel better about the message, but we must be careful to use as many sources as possible for any argument, including this one.
Excellent points. That brings up one concluding point on that question I want to bring up. And that is, there are so many real problems that exist across the world today that are uncontroversial. You know, from the immense amount of poverty and starvation that exists all over the world to the destruction of the environment we're inducing. We don't need to make up issues or rely on dubious sources in order to get our points across with the Zeitgeist Movement. In fact, we can use extremely uncontroversial, pretty much unanimously agreed upon sources for real issues that we all face without even talking about these more controversial ones. So I would say be careful of these doomsday scenarios. We don't really need them to solidify our argument, and even if they are true, it doesn't really change things in terms of what we need to do to move forwards and to try to establish a more sustainable economic system.
Absolutely, very good point there.
Okay,
do you want to read the next one for us?
Number 10. Do you think, and then we can pause there because we've got 20 questions overall. So I think at this point it makes sense to break this Q&A show into 2 different shows.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we'll go to number 10. Do you think that simpler forms of activism, such as canvassing or activities that don't necessarily involve face-to-face communication, would better serve smaller chapters of whom struggle to motivate its members to get active due to the profound understandings needed to communicate these ideas, creating a major hurdle for those who really want to get active now, but don't yet feel confident enough to represent the train of thought in an effective way? Example, putting flyers under windscreen wipers, just something simple for people who aren't yet comfortable with openly communicating with the public for whatever reason. Really good question, I think, and I think really to answer this question, it's the sky's the limit. There's no limit on the types of activism you can do. Do whatever you're comfortable with, whether it's getting up in front of a dozen people, getting up in front of several hundred people that you can gather, whether it's flyering cars like you're talking about under their windshield wipers. We used to do that in the early days here in Vancouver. Whether it's the One Planet Project, which is just talking one-on-one to people on the street, asking them some questions. Whether it's setting up a full-fledged booth, these are all fantastic ways to engage the public. And they, like you say, they both include talking directly to people face to face and not being a more anonymous level of activism. So do whatever you're comfortable with and whatever your time allows, whatever your financial means allow you to do, and that's really the best we can hope for.
Yes, there are many, many different ways. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. There are, in fact, only legal and illegal ways of doing this. It's the only thing I can think of that I would warn against. Is we've all read the story of the people who get so enamored of the movement they run around everywhere spray painting the Zeitgeist Movement all over public buildings and find themselves arrested. There is nothing we can do in that scenario if you get yourself into trouble. That is the destruction of private property, as much as we rail against it. It's advisable that you make sure you stay on the I would say socially acceptable side of things, just for your own benefit. Having said that, Occupy-like events are very, very good. I mean, of course, individuals who are not yet used to talking in public are probably not looking at that kind of thing, but it's an example of a kind of activism that essentially borders on illegal and then just simply becomes illegal once the state gets bored of you and decides to redefine that. But there's really no way of doing there's no way of doing it incorrectly. I've been in Leeds for almost 4 years now. And I must admit, I have been slow to set up a chapter there purely because I travel so much. My form of activism has been slightly different. Does that make it wrong or right? I don't know. I don't think it is wrong or right at all. And I think that anything you can do that's within your means, that can be sustainable, that you don't run out of money while you're doing it, that doesn't impinge too much on your life, and that you feel comfortable doing is always valid. Absolutely.
And also, don't burn yourself out. Don't think that you need to set up a booth or talk to people on the street 5 times a week. You're going to quickly run out of steam and burn yourself out. So try to figure out a happy medium where you can, do what you need to do in order to earn your livelihood in the market system, and while volunteering whatever you can, whatever your time and economic means allow you to.
Exactly. All right. Well, listen, we'll leave it there for this week, and we will pick up in the future on the remaining 10 questions that we have. We may even request more, actually, because it's such a useful way of sort of approaching this. It gets me to think in different ways, in ways that I haven't thought in a while, and we hope it's been useful for you as well. Meanwhile, the Zeitgeist Movement Challenge is still open for a couple of months, and that is essentially the demand of anybody who may not agree with our proposals to present in a 1,000-word form a case against a particular part, or maybe the totality of our tenets and advocations, with the possibility that we may revise, update, or discard these things, or indeed rebut them successfully using reason and the approach that we talk about, which is, of course, the scientific method when applied for the human concern and the environmental concern as well. So that's still there. Send your challenge essays of 1,000 words or less to challenge@thezeitgeistmovement.com. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that we've been requested to do at this point now is to respond to all reasonable submissions. If you're just saying, oh, TZM's New World Order, we're not even going to touch that. But anything that has a reasonable contention, a reasonable challenge, or a serious critique, I think we're at least in brief going to address that on a future radio show. Whereas we're going to take the best ones up to 3 and do a more lengthy formal critique, both in writing and hopefully inviting those people on our show.
Exactly. Excellent. Well, Mr. Berkowitz, thank you very much for joining me today and helping out with the questions. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. And I'll see you next time. And Matt, say your goodbyes if you would.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Mr. McLeish. It's been a pleasure, as always.